how can I position the United States? And of course, I'm very aware of the Helen and Mancini approach. Also, Carly mentioned the normative theories of the press. I often make reference to that and think about where the U.S. sits in that context. Also very involved in the worlds of journalism study, and we'll be, in the book that comes out next year, we'll be talking about another sort of arrangement of countries. But what I chose to emphasize here is the sort of libertarian idea that drives much of the accountability discourse in the United States. So I would not overemphasize that the United States is some sort of pure libertarian political or social system, but I think in terms of media accountability, it has a very libertarian outlook. One of my former colleagues, John Merrill, wrote the book Imperative of Freedom. This is sort of the antithesis of everything that you'll hear here today about media accountability, because he said journalistic economy is the imperative, the only valid responsibility for those who want to participate in journalism. And what that means in a nutshell is journalists should not be held accountable. Their imperative is to be free of any accountability, because that's just the beginning of some sort of slippery slope. I argue that that's a very sort of flawed normative orientation. I don't subscribe to that, but I think it's probably reasonably accurate as a description, again, of the orientation toward media accountability in the United States. So that, I think, is sort of at the heart of the American United States experience. But that sort of libertarian outlook is some of the trends that come with that, I think, are only exacerbated by the move toward digitalization and toward globalization. Maybe that will come back up here in a moment. Okay, so some of the basic implications of this sort of libertarian digital global orientation. First of all, I think what we see is diverse and ambiguous standards of accountability. So because there's no overarching framework, there are so many standards as to be, well, at a certain point, if there are so many standards, to what extent do you have standards? I think there's also in this libertarian environment a dominance of institutionalized or de-institutionalized over institutionalized sites of accountability. So I'm going to talk about sites of accountability as a distinct topic here in a moment. In this orientation as well, there are many different actors, probably a more diverse set of actors than I've heard described thus far this morning. So I'm going to talk specifically about the actors as well. And I use the term mechanisms. You'll see what that refers to here in a moment. I'm aware of some of the language that's used here in terms of sites. Might sound a little bit like instruments in some of the work that you folks have done. But I just decided to stick with my own terms for a moment and see where that leads us today. And then I'm going to talk about these processes of accountability. Again, all of these being very diverse. So one of the issues is, if we're going to talk about standards of accountability, whose standards are we talking about? And, well, there are institutional standards. And I use the word institutional as opposed to professional because in the United States, journalism does not always meet the formal criteria of what a profession is. There are not sort of licensing arrangements in the United States and things like that, and that's one of the key sort of factors. And without that, well then how do any of these sort of accountability structures even take on an institutional form? I think we can say that they do. I won't get into the how question just now, but those standards, what do they look like? Well, these are basic sort of standards that we would recognize in the West, so in that respect, they're not all that different. So you have things like accuracy, journalists should be unbiased, impartial, objective. In looking at how these standards have been articulated, we also see that they often get applied to the issue of news judgment, and that's a really difficult way to think of a standard of what news judgments are, because those are rarely articulated in explicit forms by journalists. And then there's just the standard of professionalism, which refers to a kind of conduct rather than a set of codes as such. So there are these institutional standards, but within this context, there's also been the articulation of potential problems in that some of these standards can be twisted in some way. So the whole idea of being unbiased and impartial and so forth gets twisted into this idea of false balance, and that's seen as something that needs to be addressed as well. Or the idea of being objective is seen as, in a pejorative sense, as simply stenography, just taking down what people in power say. And then there's this idea of sort of false professionalism, which I won't get into at the moment. But then there are these broader sort of social standards that are applied to journalists as well, and hence this might be a source of accountability as well. And transparency is the sort of key issue there. And transparency is a really key concept here, because transparency itself opens up the idea of accountability. And journalists are, I would say, just now embracing that. I've done some empirical research with some of my colleagues about to what extent journalists embrace transparency as a normative obligation, and that does seem to be on the uptick. But when we talk about social standards, these are standards that apply to any sort of institution in society, not just to journalists, but they apply to journalists as well, and hence they would be held accountable in this way. But some of these social standards, like humility and humanity, the humanity part comes out, I think, like in discourse on peace journalism, for example, that journalists need to be human. And then there's just my standards, which is sort of an oxymoron, right? But in a libertarian environment, everyone gets to make up their own rules, right? This is the American myth of the Wild Wild West, where every man in his 6-shooter is the law of the land. And there's evidence of this as well, where there are so many competing standards, as I mentioned earlier, that at what point does this become somewhat arbitrary? So I also raised the question then, because of this, to what extent are we even really talking about standards in any sort of intellectually honest definition of the term? If the standards are always changing, can we refer to them as standards? And I would say yes, we can, but that depends on the rate and extent to which they move. Also, I think all of the sort of diversity and ambiguity and so forth calls into question the legitimacy of the concept of standards itself. And then there's the issue in the United States of standards essentially being weaponized. And by that I mean they become a club for which to beat journalists in some form or another. And in the broad environment in which media accountability is practiced, a lot of this is done as sort of forms of symbolic violence against journalists. And in this context, I would say, is the goal really accountability, or is it dominance in some form? And it made me come up with this concept here that I think there's some of this is driven by what I would call institutional vandalism. Let's just take it down. Let's just destroy journalism because it happens to get in our way, and that's political actors, economic actors, social actors, and the like, maybe even the President of the United States. So in terms of, I wanted to think through in terms of sites of accountability, and I sort of arranged these in level of institutionalization. I spent a lot of time thinking about what institutionalization meant in this context, because I think Isation suggests that it's a process, and I don't think we're talking about a process here, but the degree in which it's institutional. But I won't burden you with that mental exercise I went through, other than to say, in the United States, there still are, if you want to see standards being articulated or used in some way, where you would see this would be in government court cases. There's been some really interesting work done just looking at libel laws and extracting from that certain standards. There are government regulatory agencies related to broadcasting, the Federal Communications Commission, and again, their rulings, their filings, we do see from occasion. More historically, of course, there was this thing called the Fairness Doctrine that articulated some principles of accountability. That has since gone by the wayside. There are also these legislative hearings and reports where media outlets are sometimes called before Congress to account for some specific perceived misdeed. Then there are press council rulings and ombudsman columns, but I would point out that press councils largely don't exist in the United States anymore. That's more historically an artifact here. And again, I think that's what makes the U.S. a bit of an outlier here. There are ombudsman positions, but they are exceedingly scarce as well. But then there are these sites that we do sort of recognize. So ethical codes. So the Society of Professional Journalists, that's what SPJ stands for, publishes these codes, of course. You have reviews like Columbia Journalism Review that take on specific journalistic issues and problems and articulate standards to some extent. You can also look at trade sites like the Poynter Institute. And then there's media reportage. Most famously in the United States, David Carr performed this role with the New York Times. It's still being done by the CNN program, Reliable Sources. David Carr passed away, and there are his replacement hasn't had the same sort of leverage and visibility that he had. And then there's just general media reporting or general reportage where the media sometimes is implicated and discussed. There are also college, university association statements. So an organization that I participate in, I barely can remember what AJC stands for, Association of Educators in Journalism and Mass Communication. They create statements about a particular problem. So just recently there was this chain, Sinclair Broadcasting, that was making its news anchors read these statements that were sort of vaguely pro-Trump statements. This was called out by universities and by this particular association that makes these kinds of statements. Then there are media watch sites. So AIM is accuracy in media. There are blogs, Crooks and Liars. These are things that sort of spring up to take on and challenge the media and its behaviors. Then of course we get to reader comment section, social media posts on Twitter and Facebook. There are letters to the editors, so accountability can happen there as well. And then finally, accountability happens through personal contact, through email, telephone calls, personal interactions. I was a journalist for 12 years and received phone calls quite frequently. The moment I would get done doing a newscast, there would be a call from someone who had a quarrel with something I said. So very closely related to these sites of accountability are actors of accountability, and I think it's important to acknowledge, at least conceptually, that those two things are different, but they're going to look very similar. So I tried to think about, well, in what categories might they fit? So I think one of these is there are officials whose charge it is to have some form of media oversight. Whether that's widely accepted or not is another matter, but there are these regulatory agencies, ombudsman, and so forth, where it is part of their job to offer media oversight and accountability. But then there are a lot of these self-appointed functionaries as well, where they take on they take on the responsibility of trying to make the press responsible. So media watchdogs, bloggers, that sort of thing. There are also, again, trying to think about this in terms of categories of actors. There are those with direct and vested interest. They've been covered by the news in a way that they don't think is accurate or complimentary or is misguided in some way. That sometimes results in libel suits. So litigants in those cases would be a kind of actor who would hold the press accountable for their actions. And then there's just citizens with some sort of general interest where they see this as part of their moral and ethical obligation, social obligation, to try to see that that journalism performs this important sort of social role. But I think there's another way to think about these actors as well. So I would say that there are these accountability officials, again, playing a formalized role. But there's also what I would refer to as accountability entrepreneurs. So they are finding a way to insert their voice, and they're entrepreneurial also in some of the standards that they articulate. They're there to, they're the ones who have used terms like false balance, for example, right? I think it's sort of an entrepreneurial development of a way to articulate a standard of accountability. And then there are these people that I would call accountability amateurs, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. You know, they're just, this is part of what they do as sort of a hobby and a sense of social obligation. So there's, they see this as an extension of their citizenship. And then I came up with this one, accountability vigilantes. You know, so again, this sort of the wild, wild west, where they play a more sort of theatrical, disruptive role up in the media. And Project Veritas is an example of that in the United States. These are these provocateurs who do undercover video of like National Public Radio and the New York Times, and then try to expose them being, you know, liberal or biased and so forth. Really operating outside of normal routine standards, processes of accountability, and in some respects trying to upend the system. And this comes back, I think, to that issue of sort of you know, institutional vandalism as well. Although in that case, I think some of these vigilantes really do have particular standards in mind. They're not just trying to destroy everything. So then I wanted to think about mechanisms as well. And here I draw a lot on institutional theory in my work, and the institutional literature suggests forms of pressure that are applied. And here again, I think these are things that could lead to potential measures or can be used in surveys of journalists and others. But so the form of pressure, that's whoever these accountability actors are, this is what they are trying to do to affect journalism. So there's this division between regulative attempts trying to affect policy, trying to affect institutional structure. So it's trying to change the environment in which journalism happens. There's also a sort of cognitive pressure to tap into how journalists think about their work and the sort of obligations they have and the like. So it's trying to get to them at that level. And then Scott and others make these sort of distinctions. A lot of it goes back to the work of Powell and DiMaggio, these institutional theorists, and they also talk about a sort of normative form of pressure. And we would probably associate this with a lot of the accountability work. It's based on norms. You appeal to sort of social and institutional values. And I suppose another way of thinking about that would just be to sort of tap into, you know, residual guilt that, I don't know, maybe is a holdover from some sort of Catholic or Protestant heritage or Jewish heritage. Well, all religions have guilt as a mechanism to some extent. I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying that. I would feel guilty if I did. And then The other way to look at this, sort of from the other side, in terms of mechanisms of accountability, is the incentive for the journalist to attend to any sort of the accountability discourses that are coming at them. And one of them is coercive, right? That they want to minimize the pressure, they want to minimize the force in some way. That they just want greater freedom to do their work or to proceed or to go on unencumbered. Very closely related to that in the US, because it's of course very much a market-based economy, is a remunerative approach, right? We want to either gain monetarily from keeping people pleased that we are in keeping with basic media accountability standards, or we're trying to avoid some sort of monetary loss that might go through like a libel court or a boycott of an organization that might affect advertising revenues, that sort of thing. And then there's, it would be a moral incentive, which sort of corresponds to the normative pressure, right, to minimize moral and ethical tension in some way, to see yourself as a good person contributing to a broad social good, to feel good about yourself, to feel a sense of moral superiority or accomplishment. So I also think there are these, I try to think about the processes as well. So there's a sort of direct interaction with the journalist. So the example of that might be, related to reader comments that happens at a site in a comment space. The actor is a commenter, the mechanism is probably a sort of normative pressure and a moral compunction on the part of the journalist. There can also be this direct interaction with the organization, but it's indirect with the journalist. So it would go through a publisher, an editor, an in-house lawyer, an ombudsman. And there, again, if we're talking like sort of how a libel case might proceed, it happens through personal contact. The actor is the litigant. The mechanism is regulative, the coercive, and then the sort of coercive remunerative motive here as well. The nature of libel law in the US is that they attach an additional monetary settlement which actually goes to those who bring libel cases, so there's an incentive to do that. And then the other is just indirect interaction with the organization, indirect with the journalist. An example of that would be a boycott. So that might happen through a media watch site which organizes or mobilizes the boycott. So there's a watch group that does that, and then there's a sort of cognitive remunerative process in that. So again, remember the context here is to think about this as a sort of libertarian system, and hence there are multiple actors, multiple mechanisms, multiple processes in which all of this happens. So some basic trends here very quickly. Overall, in the United States, we see a decline in use and effectiveness of these more institutional sites. So I already mentioned press councils are largely gone. Legal action has actually dropped precipitously. The figures that I could find only went through 2016, and there's some reason to believe that maybe they've gone up a little bit since then. But before that, the way that libel law and legislative intent and so forth was going was to be increasingly hands-off. Ombudsman sites. I did a study with ombudsman sites, and by the time we finished with the study, there were only like 2 left in the United States that were really active, actually doing what we would call ombudsman work. And now I think it's questionable if there's even 2 that are really active. The review sites, I mentioned the Columbia Journalism Review because that's one of the few that's left. The Washington Journalism Review had been an important one, and it has recently folded. So all of these sorts of more institutionalized forms of accountability structures are going away. The standards of accountability, I think they're sort of expanding. There is this revisiting of the normative roles, obligations, expectations of journalists. So again, just the idea that transparency is now becoming a standard by which journalists would be held accountable suggests that that's expanding. But we're also seeing this growing invocation of social standards, where we're treating journalists like we would just treat anyone else, because the actors now are increasingly citizens themselves, and the citizens don't have this highly developed sense of what the institutional obligations of journalism are. They just think that journalists should behave like decent people, and they don't see them as acting like decent people, so they use social standards to try to enforce that. The enforcement of standards, I think, are being increasingly crowded by this sort of institutional vandalism. We're seeing so much more of this sort of mobilization of vandals, of people who are really trying to, wreck the gears of the machinery. So it's becoming increasingly common for, actually particularly women journalists, where they are harassed habitually online, their personal information is published online, and then people show up to their homes, and we saw this with the whole sort of Gamergate controversy, which some of you may have heard of, involving gaming journalism, and it's just grown exponentially. I mean, it's still a relatively minor activity in the overall scheme of things, but that's growing as well. In terms of the mechanisms, still mostly on a sort of normative moral pressure angle, but increasingly coercive, or at least that looms, particularly post-2016. I'll come back to why 2016 in a second. Growth in direct processes of accountability, and that's what I'm referring to, citizens taking it upon themselves to contact journalists more directly. And again, that would happen in some sort of vacuum in the absence of these more institutionalized forms. So, coming back to and after in 2016, so I was thinking, well, how does Donald Trump fit into this, since he's become, how does he fit in? It seems like, he is an actor who's responding to his own sort of coverage that affects him. He has, in the overall scheme of things, not a lot of official oversight capacity. That's legislatively and constitutionally protected in the United States. But he can propose policy and can influence media routines in terms of how he's coverage. He can dictate how news conferences go about and so forth. And with policy, he's talked about, well, we need to change libel law. All these, of course, are sort of the threats approach to media accountability. So, in the US, we have this term of the bully pulpit. It means using the power of visibility to have a say, and he has certainly used the pulpit and been a bully. So again, sometimes, and I say sometimes, the goal seems to be vandalism. It's journalism is getting in the way of economic goals and political goals, and let's just see if we can muck it up and mess it up as much as we can. But he also seems a part entrepreneurial. I mean, there's this entrepreneurial sense of just using a term like fake news, or adapting, or moving that term shows a sort of entrepreneurial instinct, part sort of vigilante again, to mess things up. He clearly uses all of the mechanisms of accountability, uses all of the processes of accountability. But again, this was just to think about, well, as this scheme that I laid out, to what extent does it involve all the actors and the important actors? And when I got to the end, I said, well, hold it. I guess there's the President of the United States, and how does he fit into this? So I had to go through that as well. But this is what I think accountability looks like in what is overwhelmingly a libertarian system.